Don, there are many people who would say that there's something fundamental about consciousness. People with religious backgrounds or people who come from a philosophical view that something is very fundamental about consciousness because there's no other explanation to the mind-body problem.
Yes.
You come at it from a different way in terms of looking at evolution and the product of the human mind. So what do you say to that question? Is consciousness ultimate reality, and how would you get there?
Yes, I do take consciousness as being the fundamental reality. So it's what's called a monistic theory as opposed to dualistic theory, a monism. So you could be, if you're a physicalist, that's a monism. You're saying all that exists is physical stuff. We have to explain consciousness as emerging from physical stuff. If you're a dualist, you can, like Descartes and in many religious views, you would say there's both conscious stuff and physical stuff, and somehow they interact. And then this other view is that consciousness is fundamental. Now, the burden on me then is first to say, what do I mean by consciousness? And I want a science of consciousness, not a hand wave. So the burden is on me to give a mathematically precise model of what I mean by consciousness. Now, it'll probably be wrong, but at least it'll be precise so we can then find out why it's wrong. Then the goal is to take that precise mathematical model of consciousness and show, for example, that it precisely gives rise to our current physics, say quantum physics, special relativity, and then hopefully what everybody's going after, quantum gravity. So if we can start with a model of consciousness that's absolutely rigorous, and from that, in a mathematical sense, and then from that, get things like the wave equation of a free particle and spinor fields and spin nets and so forth, actually get real mathematical structures in physics that we know have empirical support, then I can begin to try to show that it's at least consistent to take consciousness as fundamental and to say that the physical world is simply the contents of consciousness, and to say in a mathematically precise way how the physical world is just the particular contents of consciousness or a representation of the dynamics of consciousness.
It doesn't seem conceivable that you can model consciousness with the same type of mathematical rigor that physicists can simulate and model the physics of subatomic particles in the standard model of particle physics. I mean, that just seems beyond the conception.
It turns out it's quite easy to do it. It's quite easy to get mathematical models for consciousness. If you think about it, we take for granted that we can give mathematical models of space and time, but if you just look at space and say, how do you assign numbers to points in the space? You can imagine why we didn't do it until just the last few hundred years.
Right.
It was very, very bright people who figured out how to assign numbers to the physical world, and then all of a sudden this whole thing took off. Well, they've done the hard work. Now that they've shown us how to assign numbers, or mathematical structures more generally, to things that at first don't seem amenable to it, we can now do it with consciousness. So I can say, for example, in the case of color perception, let the set X be the set of John's color perceptions. I can quantify over his color perceptions. I can start talking about transformations of his color perceptions, and I can use all the tools of mathematics to do that. So the mathematics that I use for my model of consciousness is in fact just the mathematics you need to do probability theory, and the mathematics you need to do for making probabilistic inferences, so-called Bayesian inferences. Mm-hmm. So if you just use the mathematics of probability theory and then so-called Markovian kernels, which allow you to do Bayesian inference, that's pretty much all the mathematics I need to do. And so I can say, here's a probability space of my conscious color experiences. Here's a probability space of the kinds of actions I decide to take. And I can then talk about maps among them. And I can get a mathematically precise model.
I can follow that and understand that, but it seems to be a fundamental difference than just to use a simple analogy in the physical world. One of the most, the earliest and most important is just the equation that explains the gravitational attraction between two bodies.
Yes.
I mean, that's a very simple equation in terms of inversely proportional to the square and all of that with a constant. But that you can see directly how that affects two masses, right?
That's right.
Now, that does not seem the equivalent of what you've done. You are now generalizing John's color perception, but that doesn't represent John's color perception. That's a totally different category of stuff. Whereas the two masses in the gravitational equation those are the real things that you're talking about.
So in the case of Newton and F equals G m1 m2 over r squared, that equation.
Right.
So you have the masses m1 and m2. Those are just numbers.
Right.
If you write down those numbers, they won't be heavy.
Right.
You won't feel any mass to them.
Right.
So
there's a direct correspondence. You can understand that.
There is. But in psychophysics, so this is the field of precise measurement of, say, color experiences.
Right.
What we do, even for physicalist science of perception, everybody in the field who does psychophysics uses mathematical models to represent the color experiences that they're measuring or the motion experiences and so forth. So this is actually something that's independent of my hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental. Even if you take consciousness not to be fundamental, if you want to do science of perception, and hundreds of researchers around the world are doing this, all of us use mathematically precise models in which we're actually modeling your perception of color, your perception of depth, perception of motion, and so forth, using precise mathematics.
And your claim is that that's the equivalent of assigning a number to the mass of an object.
That's exactly right. So when you do it in physics...
Does anybody agree with you on that?
Well, I think that...
Nobody at this table does.
Well, in psychophysics, it's the standard approach. So everybody in psychophysics uses
but that's
math.
a different,
Sure.
that's probably, I'm sure that's true, but that's answering a slightly different question.
Okay.
The question is it the same thing as assigning a number to two masses of body?
Oh, I think it's absolutely the same kind of thing in the sense that all you're doing with the mathematics is trying to write down a formal structure that you think mirrors the key features of the domain of interest.
Right.
And so so if I do a simulation of the weather, right, you don't expect to get wet. You don't need an umbrella to go check it out. Right. And if I give you a simulation of a mathematical model of consciousness, I'm not going to, create conscious beings. There's no ghosts that are going to appear. Yeah. And if you do the gravitational formula, you're not going to get masses, you're not going to get gravity appearing out of nowhere. So the mathematics is what it is. It's only useful to the extent that it actually allows us to predict our future experimental results. Right. And so that's the way I'm using it for consciousness as well.
But in gravity, those numbers assigned to the masses, other than relativity theory, will absolutely do it. There won't be a lot of other things you need. That number will be all you need.
That's right.
In the same case with consciousness?
Absolutely. Now, I claim the same thing will be true of consciousness. We certainly know this is the case in psychophysics, that we have very, very nice mathematical models of color space and motion perception and so forth, formulas that work out very, very nicely, that are highly consistent across observers in many cases.
So this gives you confidence that you can show that consciousness is ultimate reality. You think this mathematical modeling? Yes,
it will do it in the following sense, that it will give me a mathematical model of consciousness that will make predictions, novel predictions that are testable, and so we can know if we're on the right track or not. We're doing science.